Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, behold the lay people. They are forming study groups and chanting groups around the doctrine of the Buddha.
Fascinating. More power to them on their journey towards enlightenment. I wonder what their interpretations of the teachings are.
Many are wonderful and meritorious. They believe in the inherent value of the lives of all sentient beings. However, others are not so gracious. They also say that others must be shown the inherent value of all life by forceful or even intimidating means.
Is that not contradictory? Though the Buddha says to be wary of false doctrines and to break them down and to subdue them by preaching, debate, and good acts, he never says to break or subdue the people themselves.
Indeed, you're right. The Buddha says all sentient beings are on the path, and they cannot be taken forward or backward on that path by force. This can only happen organically, through their own karma and that of those around them.
May this group of lay people see the error in their ways.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the popular new religious movement, Sōka Gakkai. What is Sōka Gakkai? What is their history? What are some of their teachings? We hope you enjoy.
So, to start with, what is Sōka Gakkai?
Sōka Gakkai is a Japanese new religious movement based on Buddhism. When we say new religious movement, we mean a religious group formed in the last 150 years and which is peripheral to mainstream religion. It was founded in 1930 by Tsunesaburo Makiguchi and Josei Toda. Today, it is estimated to have between 12 and 20 million members in 192 countries, making it one of the largest new religious movements in the world, and certainly the largest in Japan. In many ways, these movements are responses to, or adaptations of, mainstream religion to a new set of circumstances, a new audience, or a new context which was not addressed in the mainstream religion before. New religious movements are often projects of modernization, revivalism, or, from a more cynical standpoint, commodification. Sōka Gakkai's name translates to Value Creation Society, or Society for the Study of the Creation of Value. And this name refers to a line of interpretation of the teachings of Nichiren, who we have recently discussed. This line of interpretation will be picked up again shortly, but the short version of the idea is that humans ought to make changes in their own individual lives, which are then reflected as change in the world at large. Being based on the teachings of Nichiren as it is, Sōka Gakkai is deeply concerned with social revolution and social change based on the inherent value of every single human life. The doctrine of universal Buddhahood, or the idea that every single sentient being is a Buddha now or in the future, and the doctrine of the mutual interdependence of all things are very important to Sōka Gakkai doctrine, as we will see. Sōka Gakkai practices include chanting of the Daimoku, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, and worship of the Gohonzon. It is believed, as we have mentioned before, that chanting the Daimoku, or the title of the Lotus Sutra, invokes the sacred teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and so it's used very similarly in ritual settings to mantra or to Nenbutsu chanting. The Gohonzon is a calligraphic mandala created by Nichiren himself, and is a representation of the emergence of the Bodhisattvas from the earth in Chapter 11 of the Lotus Sutra, which we've discussed in the previous upload. They also strongly advocate for proselytization, hence the significant number of members worldwide. The current president of the community is a man named Minoru Harada, and he has presided over the group since 2006. He has played a considerable role in changing and adapting Sōka Gakkai from its original form into what it is now. We'll talk more about this shortly, but Harada is known for having declared that the Gohonzon is no longer the object of worship to Sōka Gakkai, a move which further secularizes and modernizes the movement and creates distance between it and conventional, traditional mainstream Buddhism. As we have mentioned in previous episodes, Sōka Gakkai plays quite a large role in the politics of Japan. According to the Japanese Constitution, religious organizations are in no way allowed to act politically, nor is the government allowed to fund, sponsor, or show any kind of favor toward religious organizations or agendas in any way. There is an actual clause in their constitution sanctifying the separation of church and state, unlike the U.S. Constitution. However, this still does not always work out in practice. There is a political party known as the Komeito in Japan whose platform is essentially that of the Sōka Gakkai group, and which is made up almost entirely of Sōka Gakkai members. They currently hold 32 seats out of 465 in the Japanese House of Representatives, and 27 out of 248 seats in the House of Councilors. They are a junior coalition partner to the dominant political party in Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, and they are thus known to vote with them on basically every issue. As we've mentioned before, the LDP is the conservative political party in Japan.
What is the history of Sōka Gakkai?
Sōka Gakkai was founded in 1930 by Tsunesaburo Makiguchi and Josei Toda, as we mentioned before. Makiguchi was a renowned educational reformer in Imperial Japan whose platform was essentially to reform the Japanese educational system such that its goal was to find a congruence between the needs and skill sets of the child and the needs of the community. He believed that the goal of education ought to be the creation of value through the pursuit of happiness. When we say value here, we are referring not only to the value from the name of Sōka Gakkai, but also to emotional and sentimental value, social value, and spiritual value.
What about financial value?
The case for financial value is fascinating because in Buddhism, obviously, the creation of financial value is not only just not mentioned, but it's also actually discouraged in some senses. And so the creation of financial value in the Sōka Gakkai doctrine is certainly not at the forefront. However, that's how it often works out in real life. The idea was that the entire economy of the community was going to be improved if people pursue those things in their lives which give them emotional and sentimental value and give the community social value and give them spiritual value. So it's not one of the obvious forefronted values that is being created or that we're encouraging the creation of, but the argument was, in a secular sense, if you pursue all those other things, then financial value will follow suit. The idea was that, yes, every sentient being has inherent value of many kinds, but extrinsic value could be created, and the means by which that creation took place was through pursuit of one's happiness and one's own goals in life. As an example, when you buy a pair of shoes in this system, they have intrinsic value in that they protect your feet from the ground, they have financial value in that you have to pay for them, but they also have extrinsic value because the person who made them loves making shoes, and the making of the shoes created a kind of fulfillment, happiness, and spiritual contentment that could not be captured by the other kinds of value that we've mentioned. Let's explain this a little more specifically. This theory essentially arose out of Makiguchi's imperative to reform the Japanese education system, which he saw as being increasingly concerned with supporting the country's imperialist war efforts against its Asian neighbors and the rest of the world. He defined value as that which emerges or is created from the relationship or interaction between self and object. For Makiguchi, value is determined by whether something adds to or detracts from, advances or hinders the human condition. When self and object interact and the result is positive for the human condition, value is created. When the same happens and the result is negative, value is lost. As such, he had a distinctly anti-war, anti-imperialistic perspective, and he wanted to reform the country, starting with the education system, in those terms. Makiguchi's theory of value is also not at all just individual. It emphasizes a participatory interconnectedness of individuals through community engagement that meaningfully enhances the well-being of both the individual and society through the transformational process of pursuing value creation. He argued that the Japanese education system should guide a person and a community toward this goal. During his career, he met Josei Toda, and they converted to Nichiren Buddhism, and this theory of value creation mixed and melded with Nichiren Buddhist doctrine and the community, and as such, the community of Sōka Gakkai aggregated out of that. Over the course of his life, he shifted in focusing on education as the primary system of social reform to religion. This was due, in part, to how zealously he pursued Nichiren Buddhism. He didn't abandon his education reform goals as much as he saw that Nichiren Buddhism, as an inherently social reformist religion, represented an equally effective and valuable means for pursuing and achieving his goals. You remember that from the very beginning, the pursuit of spiritual value was central to his entire reform platform. Makiguchi was very humanist in that he was disgusted by the sufferings caused by the Japanese imperial machine, and he sought to reform society according to values that were contradictory to Japanese imperial goals. As such, he was arrested in 1943 as a thought criminal for his outspoken position on the war and to the imperial government. He died of malnutrition in prison in 1944, but his work was carried on by his colleague Josei Toda. Josei Toda is famous for having grown the community of Sōka Gakkai rapidly after this wartime suppression. When he was released from prison in 1945, there were only a couple dozen members who were just friends and colleagues of Josei Toda and Makiguchi themselves. And by 1958, there were as many as 750,000 families who had affiliated with the group. This was the result of a great propagation drive, which was based mainly on small group discussion meetings where a number of things occurred. These study groups worked a lot like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons do today. Representatives from Sōka Gakkai would travel to somebody's home, be invited in, and begin a dialogue with the family on the topics of religious freedom, the value of human life, and other pretty vagaries, and then the family would affiliate themselves. This was driven by charisma in some cases, but by intimidation in others. There were plenty of cases where people converted willingly, but there were also many cases where Sōka Gakkai people would destroy home Shinto altars or other competing religious paraphernalia after they had initiated dialogues with the family about the uselessness or the misdirected nature of Shinto or of other religions. They used argument, intimidation, and manipulation to make people think that they were destroying those things by their own volition, while at the same time clearing competing narratives out of the homes of their members. Either way, all of these means of proselytization and more continue to occur to this day. One reason why Sōka Gakkai's proselytization was so successful in post-war Japan was because the Japanese people, having just been defeated in the war, were poor, starving, recently bombed, and were seeking happiness and fulfillment and direction, and a new place in the world in their defeat. Most Japanese people followed one narrative, the imperial narrative, and it had led to disaster. People needed a new narrative to follow, and Sōka Gakkai was ready and waiting to fill in that space for them. They actually targeted people who were poor and sick and who had all of these woes resulting directly from the entire economy being pointed toward the war, and they said, "We can offer you a solution." In terms of doctrinal and organizational innovations, in addition to his great propagation drive, Josei Toda was also known for cementing the importance of the teacher-student lineages within the organization. He himself taught and raised his successor as president of the organization, Daisaku Ikeda. He also wrote and published a great deal about Sōka Gakkai's philosophy. He was a massive proponent of what he and scholars have called practical Buddhism. This is a version of Buddhism that is widely accessible and understandable and doable and attainable. He believed that Buddhism ought to be taught in concrete and intuitive terms rather than esoteric ones, and he attempted to direct the Sōka Gakkai movement toward those real household issues, like economic troubles, illness, social unrest, and inequality. This is part of the reason for its success in growing the organization. He sought out the poor and sick and needy and vulnerable, and he offered them a spiritual and practical solution in chanting of the Daimoku and worshipping of the Go-Hon-Zon. He argued that this would remedy their abstract woes and their real concrete ones as well. He regarded the Go-Hon-Zon as a happiness-producing machine. If you worship it, then not only does your karmic situation or your spiritual situation improve, but also simultaneously, by definition, your real-life circumstances were said to improve as well. After Josei Toda's presidency, which lasted until 1958, Ikeda Daisaku, who is still alive today, became the next president of Sōka Gakkai. Under his leadership and subsequent presidents, the organization continued to grow internationally.
Why has Sōka Gakkai been trying to distance themselves from the Nichiren Buddhism organization?
Makiguchi and Toda were part of the Nichiren Shoshu sect of Nichiren Buddhism, and thus Sōka Gakkai enjoyed a happy and harmonious relationship with them for most of their lives and careers. There were some moments of friction, though, such as in 1943, when the Nichiren sect enshrined a Shinto icon in accordance with the imperial government's efforts to propagate Shinto as the state religion of Japan. Makiguchi and Toda themselves were initially arrested and then later jailed for refusing to do this, and they were upset that they were abandoned by their sect. Other than that, things were pretty much okay between the two organizations up until 1990, when Nichiren Shoshu excommunicated Sōka Gakkai as a whole organization because of their differing interpretations of Nichiren's teachings after the war ended. Because the organization was modernizing, they would include music at their meetings or things that the Nichiren Shoshu organization viewed as sacrilegious. In response, Sōka Gakkai accused the Nichiren priests of hedonism and other improprieties, and the relations have just fully fallen out since then. In 2014, for example, the Sōka Gakkai rewrote its bylaws to reflect that it no longer had any relationship with Nichiren Shoshu or its doctrine. Again, in 2010, President Harada fully distanced themselves from Nichiren Shoshu by taking the go-home zone out of Sōka Gakkai entirely.
When talking about the foundational ideas behind Sōka Gakkai, the idea of creation of value, the assumption is that the people who are doing the thing that they're doing love the thing they're doing. So like in the example you talked about how, a shoemaker loves making shoes or something like that. So how does this philosophy handle, say, taking out the garbage or dealing with the septic tank or stuff that is obviously unpleasant like that? Like, it feels like there's an assumption that somebody's going to enjoy everything, and that's not how reality works.
In the event that somebody doesn't understand or feel any kind of joy with regards to what they're doing, then the Sōka Gakkai organization, the doctrine, then would encourage that person to lean toward understanding the function that they serve for society. So the garbage man doesn't like his job because he doesn't like garbage. He doesn't like dealing with trash all day. But he might be able to appreciate the fact that he's a sanitation worker and that sanitation is necessary for a healthy and prosperous society. And Sōka Gakkai then would also be of the opinion that that person should be compensated effectively for that sort of thing. And the truth is, with a lot of jobs in the world, in a community, in a society, the truth is if they're compensated well enough, then there's a cap to how much they could really, really, truly hate them. So in that case, even though they're not creating value between the interaction between themselves and the trash, for example, they're creating value because the community is all better off for them having done this. And so at the same time as encouraging some amount of self-directed creation of value, creation of spiritual and occupational, vocational value, they're also encouraging people to think about creating value for all of society, for the community itself.
Okay, so it's kind of a matter of, hey, you're taking one for the team, and like that's a good, valuable thing. And also it sounds like they would, hopefully at least based on that, advocate for fair wages, which is much better than most companies are doing today. So at least from the outside, all of that seems harmless enough or even useful, but at the same time, we have more of an episode to talk about, so let's get into those ideas. So, aside from what we've already discussed, of course, what are some of their teachings?
So we've already talked about this theory of value creation quite a bit, of human life and social revolution, and so we should fill in some more of the Buddhist stuff that they believe as well. We have mentioned that universal Buddhahood and the interdependence of all things is very important to them. Ichinen Sanzen, or 3,000 realms in a single thought moment, is also very important. We discussed this doctrine in episode 35, What is Buddhist Cosmology? In short, this is a doctrine penned by Nichiren that argues that within a single thought moment, all of reality, categorized in 3,000 realms or states of being, unfolds itself completely. For more on that, refer to our previous episode, which I'll link in the show notes. In Sōka Gakkai, this doctrine is interpreted kind of differently from the way that Nichiren presents it. Rather than being a cosmology or an explanation of the unfolding of reality in these rather abstract terms, the 3,000 realms are regarded in Sōka Gakkai as being possible states of being that we can choose to enter into and navigate in the pursuit of creation of value. In this way, they are psychologized. We are in the realm of animals if we are angry. We're in the realm of hungry ghosts if we are covetous, etc. Instead of this being the basic code of reality, as Nichiren presents it to be, the 3,000 realms in a single thought moment is more like a tool for understanding why negative feelings led to negative circumstances, and why negative circumstances led to negative feelings. The idea is that if you're angry at the government, or at your neighbor, or at anybody at all, you enter the realm of animals, and things are considerably worse in the realm of animals, as we've discussed. Their karmic situation is very bad. Therefore, they argued that if you entered that realm, then bad things would happen to you commensurate with the karmic situation of the realm you were in. and the Go-Home Zone in the Daimoku served as viable routes out of that realm and into the realms of joy, where good things would happen to you because your karmic situation would be improved. All of this doctrine is modernized and muted a bit in contemporary Sōka Gakkai, but it is still on their website, so it really should be mentioned here. As you can see, it has some very obvious victim-blamey types of implications that probably were not actually the intention of the people who penned these interpretations, but should be mentioned. Another point to mention in Sōka Gakkai is the drive for proselytization. We don't commonly think of Buddhism as a proselytizing religion, but the Lotus Sutra tells its readers to go out and spread its teaching all over the world by means of the 5 practices, which were to embrace, read, recite, expound, and transcribe the sutra. Nichiren thought this was particularly important and even had an interpretation of this idea called shakubuku. This idea originates in a different sutra, and it refers to defeating false doctrines through preaching, debate, and argument. Combined with the doctrine of skillful means presented in the Lotus Sutra, it becomes much more than that. The character shaku means to break, and buku means to subdue. This was figurative, like how in English we say shooting down someone's idea. You don't actually fire a weapon at anything. In Nichiren's interpretation, the essential teaching of the sutra ought to be promulgated by means of shakubuku, which could mean argument and debate and preaching, but it could also mean a literal interpretation of breaking and subduing. It could mean intimidation, force, and other gross means. For Lotus Sutra groups during the wartime period of Japanese history, you can see how this got very dangerous. There were apocalyptic Lotus Sutra groups which sought to establish a Lotus Sutra empire across the world by means of subduing and conquering everyone in a militaristic sense under the Lotus Sutra banner. During the war period, Sōka Gakkai also held this interpretation, as was made obvious by the intimidation methods that I mentioned earlier. However, after the post-war period, they did away with that stuff because it was really getting them a lot of bad press. People were accusing them of being a cult, and that's not something that you want your new religious movement to be called, especially in contemporary times. Similarly, it just didn't fit with other doctrines that they were teaching. As such, they reinterpreted and repackaged shakubuku to just mean sharing the essential teaching. The idea being that the essential teaching was strong enough on its own to beat down and subdue any other competing narratives or doctrines in that more figurative sense that we mentioned before. This was actually one of the points that further soured relations between Sōka Gakkai and Nichiren Shoshu, who still saw the old-school shakubuku, the violent one, as a viable and legitimate means of proselytization. Nowadays, there is Sōka Gakkai in Japan, and there is Sōka Gakkai International, an organization which is mainly targeted toward Westerners. This organization was founded in 1975 in Guam as a result of Ikeda Daisaku's continued work internationalizing Sōka Gakkai. This organization may seem like the non-Japan contingent of Sōka Gakkai, but it is more like an NGO, or non-government organization. Sōka Gakkai International, or SGI, is not really as closely unified as Sōka Gakkai on practices of the Lotus Sutra. They don't really chant a lot of Daimoku or look at the Go-Home Zone that much. Instead, they're mainly a non-profit organization which engages in activism, interfaith dialogue, and other types of social engagement. They're very strong advocates of nuclear disarmament, of environmental activism, and of better and stronger education systems around the world. Additionally, they do a lot of humanitarian aid work. They have had some really famous members, such as Tina Turner, Wayne Shorter, Orlando Bloom, Herbie Hancock, Courtney Love, and many more. As you can see, this is not as distinctly a religious organization as the original Sōka Gakkai, because their platform is really just do as much good as possible around the world.
So looking at this kind of from the outside, that accusation of being a cult is a really heavy-handed thing to go for, but at the same time, I wouldn't call this a cult, but it seems like it has some culty parts to it. The main part that really fails the cult sniff test at this point is it doesn't sound like they have much of a charismatic central leader figure at this point. And based on what you were talking about in its history, it doesn't sound like the original members took that role either. Like, a cult has a leader, generally, that is the source of a lot of the culty parts of this, and it seems like that's not what's going on here.
You're absolutely right about that. And another point where it fails the cult sniff test for me also is there is a distinct lack of an enforcement arm, which essentially polices the thoughts of the people in there. Of course, it's a politically active organization, and it's a politically motivated organization, and they do have a distinct platform. However, just because they have that, if a member enters and leaves of their own accord, or if they have dissenting opinions, they may not be platformed or listened to on a wide scale or basis, but they also won't be punished, and they won't be enforced the narrative of the larger group by those in power at the group, right? There's been cases, of course, of this violence and this intimidation and stuff that we've talked about in terms of conversions, but that quickly stopped after they got labeled a cult for those things. And they were able to look at shakubuku as a doctrine and say, this isn't working. This isn't a good interpretation of how we can do this. And the changing sentiments in the rest of Japan in the post-war also helped kind of fix that problem, because it just wasn't fitting in with Sōka Gakkai doctrine or with the regular sensibilities of Japanese people.
Yeah, there's definitely elements of this that squick me out. Like, anything that's going for proselytation on this level is going to get my suspicion immediately. And there's definitely parts of this that I don't like, but what you have described, the cult label is too extreme.
Exactly. I think so too. New religious movements themselves, I don't think are harmless unless they are harmful, right? And so just because it's a new religious movement is not enough to call it a cult. And I think that this one, even though it is a new religious movement, is just fine.
I don't know if I would say just fine. They are destroying people's shrines, at least once upon a time, but like I said, cult is too much.
Yeah.
I have heard a lot of people researching what I would call cults who instead use the term new religious movement. And so, like, just the definition of cult in general is a fuzzy thing that is, I think we've talked about before, how it's difficult to put down concrete terms.
For more on that, see our previous episode on Buddhist cults, which I will link in the description.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on Sōka Gakkai. Join us next week, where we will discuss Pratyeka Buddhas. What are Pratyeka Buddhas? What is their status in the canon? How ought we understand them? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.